others. The vice president also responded directly to a comment that was made about him by the Democratic Senate candidate from Michigan, Abdul El-Sayed. It was pretty personal. In the vice president's new book, Communion, which details his journey from atheism back to Christianity. Now, my interview with the vice president. Vice President JD Vance, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm going to get to your extraordinary book here in a moment. I read it. I'm very taken with the stories, and I'm fascinated by it. But I do want to start, Vice President, with some news of the day. And there was big news that you were in the Senate this week. You went to a lunch with senators. Iran dominated the conversation. So I was hoping you could give us a readout of that meeting.
Yeah, well, love to go and hang out with some of my old GOP colleagues in the United States Senate. Great guys, people who are trying to do the right thing by the country. We talked about a number of issues. We talked about the budget reconciliation legislation that we're working on. Obviously, the president's priority right now is to get the Save America Act passed. I think it's absurd that we're the most advanced democracy in the entire world, and yet we don't have voter ID. That really has to change. We also, of course, talked a lot about Iran. And where Iran is today, Kayleigh, is that we're talking to the Iranians, of course. We're trying to maximize the amount of oil and gas that are coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. That's the thing that we're most focused on right now. And you see, I think, oil prices dipping around $80 a barrel today, sometimes a little bit lower. So we're just trying to make sure that we get what we need out of this particular conflict. If you go back and remember what it is that we've done here, we've destroyed their nuclear program, we've destroyed their conventional military, we've radically reduced their, what you might call their asymmetric military abilities, and right now we're trying to see if they're willing to make the kind of long-term changes that would be necessary to have a better relationship with the United States, and if not, that's fine too. We're just going to keep on applying the pressure that we can apply and getting as much oil and gas out of the Middle East so that Americans can enjoy lower gas and energy prices. So that's the delicate dance. The final thing I'll say about this, Kayleigh, is I try to remind people that we're really in the middle of the game here. This thing is not over. It's obviously not at the beginning. We're in the middle of the game, and we're applying a whole host of tools, diplomatic, economic, military tools, to ensure that we get the best outcome for the American people. I feel quite confident we will get there, but we're still a bit in the middle of the game.
And the Iranians, through different methods, have broadcasted that they look to tighten their grip on the Strait of Hormuz. So in a theoretical deal, what would an acceptable status quo be for the Strait?
Well, our expectation is you're going to see the same amount of oil and gas come out of the Gulf that you saw before the conflict started. That is what the Iranians have told us that they are going to do. That's what the entire Gulf coalition wants to do as well. But, we don't trust, we verify. We actually look not at people's words, but at people's deeds. You see some people within the Iranian system, of course, talk about tolling. The Iranians have told us they have no plans to toll the Strait of Hormuz. But again, we're going to see what actions actually happen. What's been going on for the past week or so is that the Iranians and the Gulf countries, particularly Oman, have been talking about how to ensure the safe flow of traffic. The one problem, of course, is the Iranians laid a large number of mines at the beginning of the war. And so what we're really working through now is how you can actually set up a traffic scheme so that the ships that pass can pass through safely. That includes, of course, demining. That also includes a commitment from the Iranians that they're not going to fire at commercial vessels. They're hurting in a big way. They want this thing to be over. The question is whether their system is able to give the things that are necessary for us to be happy, for us to feel like we've gotten what we need out of this particular engagement. That is still to be determined, but I do think that we've made some progress over the last few days.
So to domestic politics, you had some policy critiques, some very fair ones, of El-Sayed, of course, the Democratic nominee for Senate in Michigan. Rather than responding to your policy critiques, here's how he responded. Listen to this.
Is that Peter Thiel's boy with that Ohio charisma he's got? That guy. I think we've had enough of him. The last thing that he said that made any sense was hillbilly elegy after he said that Donald Trump had no business being president of anything. That was the last time he made sense, and then he decided to suck up to power.
What's your response?
Well, look, I don't pay that guy much mind. The problem with El-Sayed is that he is a person who claims to stand for working people, and yet he opposed Donald Trump's policies that have quite literally saved the Michigan auto industry. This is not a guy who wants a prosperous economy where auto workers and everybody else can actually raise a family. ideally on a single wage if they so choose. What he is actually trying to build is an economy where you tax some people, you give it to Democratic Party favored interest groups, and that's just not how you create prosperity. You create prosperity by actually rebuilding the middle class of this country, rebuilding the industrial foundation of middle class prosperity. So, of course, he's going to make personal insults. He's also gone after my kids. He's just kind of an odd guy. But I think that it's telling that instead of talking about what he wants to do to make the lives of Michiganders better, he takes personal insults at me. I'm the vice president. It comes with the territory. I think the guy's crazy and would be a terrible senator for the people of Michigan. We're going to make that case, and obviously the people of Michigan are going to make their vote.
And one thing that he doesn't talk about too often, but you certainly do, is fraud. And the American people care deeply about it. I watched your fraud roundtable, the task force, with great interest this week. You laid out a 3-part plan for Congress to help out with this. And one of the interesting points was data sharing and forcing Democratic states to share their data with you. I'm curious why you would need legislation to force Democrats to combat fraud. I would think they would willingly turn this information over to you.
You would think so, Kayleigh, but unfortunately, too much of the Democratic Party boss runs on the money that comes from fraud. The NGO network, the political parties, some of the nonprofit organizations in these blue states, they actually depend on the fraud to fund their operations. And to explain this a little bit to the American people, Kayleigh, the craziest thing, I was literally shocked by this the first time that I realized that when we send, for example, $8 billion to the state of California to run their food stamp program, they don't even verify eligibility. You could have illegal aliens on that program. We have no sense at the federal government. We send them $8 billion. It goes out the door, and we have no way of confirming whether the state of California is actually spending that on needy Americans, because, of course, we want to help people who can't afford a bite to eat. But the program is not there for illegal aliens. It's not there for fraudsters. And what California and so many blue states have done is really turn down the eligibility requirements, turn down the verification requirements, and we unfortunately are just going to have to force them into some basic stuff. Things like checking when somebody signs up for food stamps. Are they in this country legally? Do they actually have proper photo identification? Have they committed a terrible felony in the last couple of years? Basic eligibility checks that so many blue states are not doing. So we're going to have to force them to do that. And that's one of the things we've talked about with our congressional colleagues, is just forcing some of these blue states to share the data. I will say, Kayleigh, in the defense of some blue states, some Democrats have been willing to work with us because they recognize that fighting fraud should be a bipartisan issue. Unfortunately, you've got the Californias and the New Yorks of the world who seem to want their states to be defrauded by the fraudsters, but we can't let that happen. It's gone on for too long, and the president has asked us to stop it. We're finally taking it seriously.
Have any Senate Democrats called you and said, hey, how can we help with these legislative priorities?
I'm not holding my breath, Kayleigh. Unfortunately, the Senate Democrats are too captured, I think, by the far left of their own party. Where you've had Democrats work with us, it's local officials, state officials, some attorneys generals whose job it is to prosecute the fraud. And so they realize how terrible the problem is. But unfortunately, Kayleigh, this is the story of the National Democratic Party leadership. They won't do the things that even their own voters want them to do. You ask about fraud. I think one of the most serious frauds in our country is voter fraud. 80% of Democrats would love to see voter ID, but we can't get a single Democrat to help us with the Save America Act. I don't think, unfortunately, we're going to have too many Senate Democrats who are trying to stop the fraud. It's a shame because I'd love to work with them.
It is. Well, to your extraordinary book, Communion, I loved reading this because as I started reading this, your upbringing, at least theologically, reminded me of my upbringing. I was an evangelical Christian. I read Tim LaHaye. I read C.S. Lewis. I went to Young Life. These were all things that were a part of my life, and they were a part of yours. And then there was this turn to atheism for a few years, and I'm wondering if you could tell me how that happened.
I think a couple things happened, Kayleigh. First of all, because I did have some foundation in my faith, but it wasn't really connected to a particular church or a particular institution. It was connected to my grandmother. She was the person who read the Bible to me. She was the person that I talked to God about. And so, when she passed away shortly before I left for Iraq in 2005, I just lost that connection to my faith. And without being properly rooted, I lost my faith altogether. And I think what happened to me, Kayleigh, is that I realized that I went through this, what I would call an arrogant atheist phase, where I didn't just not believe in God, but I sort of thought that I knew better than other people who did, is that I realized that wasn't making me a good person. It was making me worried about, where I went to school and how much money I made and all these sort of worldly pursuits. They were making me very successful. I was getting good jobs. I was going to good schools, but they weren't making me a good human being. And the more that I thought about what is it that actually makes a person good and virtuous, what are the things that actually matter, the more I realized that, these Christians that I'd kind of dismissed for a period of my life, they actually had their act together. And if they had their act together, maybe it was rooted in some truth about the divinity of Jesus Christ, about the fact that he came and died for us. And so I started to be curious in Christianity because I saw the truth of Christianity reflected in a lot of people around me.
Yeah, and the way you described this, I thought it was so interesting because it was not this epiphany of, wow, atheists are correct intellectually. I've been brainwashed in a classroom. You describe it as it's not hearing an anti-Christian worldview every morning in college lectures. It's having a routine Christian existence replaced by something different. I'm curious if your return to Christianity, to Catholicism, was that incremental or was there an aha moment?
It was very incremental. I've never had an epiphany, Kayleigh, though I've certainly had these moments where I felt the presence of God. I talk, for example, about this, moment that I had at a conference where a friend and I were talking about Christianity and talking about Catholicism. And there was this moment where a glass fell off the wall at the point of our conversation where, I think an atheist would dismiss that as, oh, who cares? A glass fell off the wall. But at that moment, it felt like God was trying to send me a message. You have these little moments like this, but I never had an epiphany. What I did is have this slow realization that Christianity was true. And it really did start with this recognition, Kayleigh, that so many of the Christians that I saw around me, obviously we're all imperfect people, but they had their act together. They were focused on the things that really mattered. I didn't care, and frankly, my wife didn't care whether I was super successful, whether I became the vice president or a best-selling author or successful in business. She just wanted me to be a good man, and I wanted to be a good husband and a good father. And I felt like Christianity answered that yearning better than anything else that I saw in the world. And that really is what led me back, but it was a slow process.
Yeah, no doubt Christianity holds the answer. There was also a moment in your book that I was fascinated by, and it's a car incident that you had. You were driving back from Mama's funeral, and I hope that you could tell me this story, and you almost got into a car accident, but you didn't. And I'm wondering if you could share that story and then answer if you thought that was supernatural.
Yeah, so I definitely do think it was supernatural. I mean, I talk about, this quote from the movie Pulp Fiction that what matters is not whether it's an according to Hoyle miracle. What matters is whether you feel the touch of God. And what happened to me, Kayleigh, is I was returning from my grandmother's funeral in eastern Kentucky. I was driving back to my Marine Corps base in North Carolina, and I was on one of these sort of narrow mountain backcountry roads, and I kind of came around a corner. I guess it had been raining, and I was going a little bit too fast. And it was one of these moments where, the car is spinning. You don't know when it's going to stop. And if it doesn't stop, you're going to tumble over the mountain and be seriously injured or worse. But the car came to this perfectly gentle stop right as I was about to fall over the mountain. And again, maybe the laws of physics can explain what happened, but in that moment, I felt the touch of God. And I think my own attitude on this, Kayleigh, I've talked to a lot of friends, atheists and Christians about this, is that God is always sending us these little messages. It's not necessarily with a megaphone. It doesn't necessarily smack you across the face, but there are all of these subtle moments